Okay, so this is redoing the section of Anna Maria project that got stolen on the stolen camera. It covers. It starts. The last one I did was ending with Deuteronomy and the Sinai Covenant. So this section now covers books of Joshua, Judges, and moves into 1st and 2nd Kings. It's going to eventually end with the Davidic covenant. There we go. So we left off in our last session with Moses instructing the new generation of Israel, standing literally on the borders of the Promised Land. Remember, this is the group whose parents had refused to enter the Promised Land. God had to wander them around the wilderness for 40 years until they produced the next generation, their kids, growing up, being a sizable group now. And now they stand on the border of the Promised Land, facing the same choice their parents did. Will you trust God to enter into the Promised Land, or will you allow fear? Fear of the large people who live in that land who don't like you, fear of famine, fear of wild animals, fear of anything that would prevent you from living out your calling as God's people. And that's how the book of Deuteronomy closes. What we're going to look at now are the books of Joshua. We'll start with Joshua, Judges, and we'll eventually in this session even move into the books of Kings, where the first 3 kings are discussed. Saul, David, including the covenant that David enters into with God, as well as David's son Solomon. So, book of Joshua. As Joshua opens, it turns out that Joshua, who's been Moses' right-hand guy, Joshua is about to lead this new generation into the Promised Land. God speaks clearly to Joshua, and then to Joshua, through Joshua to the people. And through Joshua, he simply reminds this generation of the 2 things, the 2 primary things that their parents refused to remember. First, keep my law. Keep my law. Remember, law simply refers to the terms of the Sinai covenant. It's like saying keep covenant with God. Be faithful. Be obedient. Live out the promises you made to God when you said, yes, we want to be your people. So keep covenant, keep my law. Secondly, be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. Apparently, God believes that we can choose either fear or courage when faced with difficult situations. I don't usually quote Will Smith too often, but there's that moment in his movie, After Earth, in which Will says to his son, danger is real, but fear is a choice. I think that's exactly the point God was trying to get through to the Israelites here. Look, the dangers are real, but the question is, will you choose fear in response to those dangers, or will you choose trust in God? Now, trust in God doesn't make the dangers go away, but what it does is it places you within the protection of God's covenant love and covenant blessings. It doesn't mean bad things won't happen. What it means is whether bad things happen or not, you are in the midst of God's will, and God will never leave or forsake you. His presence, His power walk with you. And this is what Joshua now is trying to communicate to this next generation. And so, they enter the Promised Land. Once again, some spies go in to check it out. Beautiful little story in chapter 2 where they run into a Canaanite prostitute named Rahab. And Rahab's about the last person on the planet you're going to think of as people of God, as a person of God, right? She's a pagan person, doesn't worship Yahweh, is a prostitute, isn't in what you'd call a godly profession, and yet she exercises faith in God by protecting the Israelite spies, not turning them over to her countrymen, and just trusting in God. And God blesses this Canaanite prostitute. She ends up being saved from Jericho's pillage when the Israelites finally come through in a few chapters. And she ends up actually being a foremother in the lineage of Jesus. If you flip in your Bible over to Hebrews 11, she turns out to be in the lineage of Jesus and a woman of faith that's held up as an example for us. So just strong reminder that whatever circumstances we find ourselves in, whoever we are, trusting in God can bring about blessing and covenant faithfulness. And now, after the spies have kind of checked out the land and returned, now Joshua leads the people over the Jordan River, which is that borderland to the promised land, and into the promised land finally. Now, this becomes a critical moment. Crossing the Jordan now becomes an important theme in biblical history. Centuries later, when Jesus comes, we're going to find that John the Baptist, preparing for Jesus' ministry, starts baptizing people in the Jordan River, probably having them get into the Jordan and then come back up out of the Jordan River to the promised land, much as Joshua had the people cross over the Jordan into the promised land. We'll come back to that when we get to the ministry of Jesus. Chapter 5 comes in Joshua, and we hear something. Should it surprise us? I don't know. Turns out Joshua has to circumcise this generation before he can continue his journey into the promised land. And you want to go, what? Wait. What do you mean circumcise them? Their parents sort of circumcised them when they were infants, right? That was the covenant with Abraham, sign of the covenant. Well, we have here one more indication that earlier generation, their parents, didn't even continue the covenant sign of the Abrahamic covenant with these kids. They refused to keep covenant with God once again. So Joshua has to now circumcise grown men, which is a far more serious procedure than on an infant. Takes a few days of healing, no doubt, as the text says, before they're ready to continue moving into the promised land. Now they start moving through the promised land and taking possession of territory. This book is not an easy book to read when it comes to this topic. A lot of bloodshed, a lot of violence. We're not going to, in this session, talk about how to wrestle with that, but a really important question arises here. How do we as kingdom people, as people following the agape love of Jesus, the non-violent love of Jesus, how do we reconcile Jesus and his teachings of nonviolence with the violence of God's people? In fact, what appears to be God commanding his people to do violence in Joshua and other places in the Old Testament. Of course, our preaching pastor, Greg Boyd, has taught on this, preached on this, actually written 2 sizable volumes on this with a smaller version as well. His Crucifixion of the Warrior God book really dives into this topic and offers a unique way of thinking about how to reconcile the nonviolence of Jesus with the violence of the portraits of God in the Old Testament. I encourage you to check that out if you're interested in that topic. His smaller book, Cross Vision, will give you the same idea in less than 1,400 pages, which the big book is. With the fall of Jericho and others, though, I think, among other things, we should notice this. There's a pattern that God has with his people that when they do engage in warfare, physical warfare with others, it seems that God's primary purpose was not to have them do violence, but rather to do the sorts of things you would think would never work in a military exercise, things like marching around a city and just blowing some horns, which is how the Jericho incident goes down. They don't, try to scale the walls or batter ram down the gates of the city. No, they just obey God by marching around the city, and God then shows up. What God is showing, among other things, is that God's protection will be with his people, his covenant remains with them, and that they don't have to trust in their military strength or how many soldiers they have. In fact, it's actually a violation of the law of Sinai, to count Israel's troops. David eventually will violate this law. He'll number his troops. He'll count up how big his army is. But God's point was always, don't trust in the number of troops you have. Trust in me. And quite often, as we'll see in some of these encounters, God doesn't need violence in order to get Israel into place. He needs them to trust him. It's always about covenant trust. Chapter 9 is a fascinating chapter. Joshua chapter 9, when it comes to the question of covenant relationship. In fact, I want to give you a few minutes to consider Joshua 9. You'll have a chance to read through this chapter and have some discussion at your table. And I'd like you to, as you read and discuss this section of Scripture, ask yourself two questions. One, what did you find surprising, even troubling, about this story in Joshua 9? And it involves a covenant. Two, what do you think this story teaches us about God's view of covenant relationship? I'll give you a few minutes to read and consider that story together. And now the exercise happens, and then we come back. Having had a chance to look at Joshua 9, I'm sure you were as surprised as I was the first time I read it that this is a covenant made by Joshua and the Israelites with the Gibeonites. And they never should have made that covenant, right? The Gibeonites lied to Joshua and the Israelites about who they were. They actually did live in the Promised Land, and Israel wasn't supposed to make a covenant with people in the Promised Land. They were supposed to push them out. They lied to Joshua, saying they were just nomads traveling through. Joshua believed them, made a covenant of peace with them, then found out they'd lied to him about who they were. Now, you might think there's no better example of a covenant that should be null and void, because it was made under false pretenses, under the guise of a lie. And yet God says to Joshua, look, you made the covenant, you keep it. I think what this does, among other things, is shows us just how serious God is about covenant relationship. God will actually change his will. In this case, he does. He tells to Israel now, look, instead of going to war against them, you protect them now, because they've made a covenant of peace with you, and you chose to willingly do that. Strong statement about the seriousness with which God takes our covenants between each other. The next number of chapters, really chapters 13 through 22, a big chunk of the book of Joshua, is largely about Israel now continuing to occupy the land, the Promised Land, and then dividing it up between the 12 tribes of Israel. And the last kind of covenantal moment we'll mention for this book is the last chapter, chapter 24. It's a covenant renewal ceremony. Joshua leading this new generation that's now in the land. They're actually living finally in the Promised Land where God had promised Abraham, you'll have kids, you'll have land, you'll have a nation. Well, they're finally there. They've got their land. They're living together. And Joshua leads them in a covenant renewal ceremony. And to prepare them for this, Joshua utters what have become very famous words out of this book. He says, choose this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. And so it's a rallying cry. It's an inspiring speech. It's a call from Joshua to the people of Israel to step up and really decide here and now. Look, you saw what your parents did. They refused to trust God. You've seen how God's been with you. He's got you in the land here. The question now is, how will you live in the land? Will you continue to remember God, to place him first as king, and to live your life in that posture? Or will you forget about God, eventually be captured by the pagan cultures around you, and begin to live like they do? You've got a choice. Follow the culture or live counterculturally in the ways of the covenant of Yahweh God. In this final chapter, Joshua casts that vision and puts that call out to them. And appropriately, we turn in the next book of Judges, to really the first snapshot of what life in the Promised Land is looking like for Israel. And if you're hoping for a beautiful picture, almost from the get-go, we see that things are not going well. Instead of trust, there's frequent disobedience. Instead of keeping the law, there's frequent breaking of the law. Instead of worshiping Yahweh alone, there's going to be times of mingling with the surrounding pagan culture, even to the point of adopting pagan practices and idolatry. What we find in the book of Judges, this kind of first episode of living in the Promised Land, is a four-part cycle that really structures the whole book of Judges. This four-part cycle happens over and over and over. Here's the four parts. It begins this way. It begins with Israel breaking covenant. One way or another, they break covenant with God, almost always by worshiping the false gods of the people that they're supposed to have pushed out. And so they, instead of staying faithful and separate from pagan practices, start adopting pagan practices. Now, when they break covenant by worshiping false gods and idols, God steps back. He steps back, right? They break relationship with him, and God's response has to be to acknowledge that. Okay, you're choosing to break relationship with me. I'm stepping back. I'm withdrawing then. Now, once God withdraws, look, you don't want the presence of God to withdraw from you, because with the presence of God comes his power, his love, his protection, his covenant blessing. When God is a step back because the people have broken covenant, that means they're open to the enemy and the plans of the enemy, to the destruction of the enemy. And so they begin to experience that. They experience warfare. They experience all the curses that come with covenant breaking. And so once they start experiencing these difficult things, then they remember, oh, that's right, we should have trusted God. So part 3, they cry out to God for deliverance. Part 1, they break covenant. Part 2, God steps back, withholds his blessings. Step 3, oh, that's right, God save us. They start calling out to God. And part 4, God faithfully sends someone to deliver them. A human being. It's a judge, and thus the name of this book, Judges. Judges are people that God raises up from within Israel to go and, on his behalf, lead his people back out of the problem, whatever they're facing, and back into relationship with him. This pattern happens over and over and over in this book. The two common refrains that we hear in this book are these two things. First, the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. You hear this verse over and over and over in this book. It's part of this four-part cycle. And the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. You also hear this refrain, second most common refrain in this book. Now in those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. There was no king in Israel, So everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Now, these two refrains really mean the same thing. When you're doing what's evil in the sight of God and doing what's right in the sight of your own eyes, well, now we're back to the garden, aren't we? What we have in the problem in the book of Judges is no different than the problem in the Garden of Eden. It's just now, instead of it being the first two human beings, now it's an entire nation, Israel, that's supposed to be following God. We're back to the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, aren't we? Instead of trusting God and doing what's right in His eyes, we decide, no thank you, God, we'll decide what's right in our own eyes. And when we do that, when we think we can be the judge of what's right or wrong, inevitably we confuse things. Because what's right in our own eyes is frequently what's wrong in God's eyes. We don't have His perspective. We're not possessors of His wisdom. We're not in the place of the omniscient God. And so this is the history of Israel through the book of Judges, doing what's evil in God's eyes because they decided to do what's right in their own eyes. God continues, however, to deliver His people. Whenever they do these evil things, they eventually cry out to God, and God sends a deliverer, a judge. Now, how this judge thing works is interesting. Remember, there's no king here. That phrase, there's no king in Israel. No, there's not, because God is supposed to be their king. They don't need a human king if they follow God as king. When they get into trouble, God can raise up a judge. Now, this judge, it doesn't mean necessarily, we think of a courtroom when we think of judge. The judges in the book of Judges do more than that. They're military leaders. They are wise leaders who can lead people back out of idolatry and towards worship of Yahweh. Yes, they sometimes actually do what we might think of as legal judging, but they do a whole lot of other things as well. They settle disputes. They lead the military, a range of duties these judges have. How God structures the judgeships is really important. There's three dimensions to these judgeships that distinguish them from God setting a king up. First, when God chooses a judge, it is temporary. You don't become a judge forever. You become a judge for as long as God needs you to. So God chooses, for example, Gideon at one point, Deborah, a female judge, at another point, and He calls them out of whatever occupation they're doing for this season of functioning as a judge. But they eventually go back to what they were doing. In other words, God's not setting up a new institution. He's allowing people to use their gifts for the community when necessary. Beautiful picture of gift-based leadership for a season of need. Secondly, judgeship is not transferable. In other words, just because you're a judge doesn't mean your kids will be a judge. Now, in kingship, when a human king is going to die, they look to who's the son. Or perhaps if no son, who's the daughter, right? That's how the ancient world worked, is they passed their dynasties along to their kids. This doesn't happen here. It's temporary and it's non-transferable. Third, it's unpredictable. It's surprising. God chooses some people you would never expect. You'd never expect, well, certainly not in this day of age, you'd never expect a woman, and yet one of the very first judges we hear about in the book of Judges is Deborah. God is willing to violate social values as He puts people in place based on their gifting and their faithfulness to Him, not on how society would rank them in hierarchical social standing. Another beautiful picture of how God values humans and looks to our inherent worth and then the gifts we possess that He's given us, of how those can bless a community. What God is doing here is He's willing to raise up humans for particular purposes and seasons, let them go back to their normal life, so that so that Israel doesn't confuse the judges with being a king. Kings have power. Kings have dynasties. Kings pass their power, their wealth, and their dynasty on to their family members. And God's saying, no, no, no. I'm your king. I'll send you judges when you need them. It's really an anti-kingship way of leading a nation. And it's beautiful because what God is saying is, I'm your king. You don't need a human king with all this elite power and wealth and prestige. I'm your king. Trust in me. I'll give you judges when you need them. Let's go. Let's move as a unique, distinct, countercultural people in this way of leading. A few of the key moments in the book of Judges. We've talked about Deborah, a woman who was both a prophetess and a judge, delivered Israel from her enemies. There's Gideon. Gideon's famous Gideon's fleece moment, when Gideon put before the Lord a fleece to test God. Are you sure you're calling me to be a judge? He was resistant, really, to that judgeship. Eventually, he does respond to the call, and he eventually gathers an army. Here's another really beautiful moment of how God chooses an army. Now, when Gideon's putting his army together, he calls what you might think of the potential fighting unit of Israel, all the men who are of fighting age. And it turns out to be quite a number of them, 32,000. God says, that's too many. I want you to reduce. Phone's ringing and buzzing, and I'm sure you probably heard it. Break. We'll start that section again.